We'll be here for just a little bit longer. If I remember correctly now, we're studying Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and so forth. So all of you turn with me and we'll begin reading at verse 8. I'm talking about Hebrews 11, verse 8. And let's read down, if you will, down through let's go down to verse 24. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed to go out unto a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise, as in a land not his own, dwelling in tents, with Isaac and Jacob the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for the city which hath the foundation, whose builder and maker of God. By faith even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she was past age, since she counted him faithful who had promised. Wherefore also there sprang of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of heaven in multitude, and as the sand which is about the seashore innumerable. These also died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things make it manifest that they are seeking after country of their own. And if indeed they had been mindful of that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed of them to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, being tried, offered up Isaac. Yea, he had gladly received the promises, was offering up his only begotten son. Even he to whom it was said, In Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God is able to raise up even from the dead, from whence he did also in a figure receive him back. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph, and worshipped leaning upon the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when his end was nigh, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel, and gave commandments concerning his house. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is no greater figure in the Bible outside of Jesus himself than this man Abraham. And as I've emphasized time and time again, and I do it again right now, that if you lay any claims to being a student of the Bible, you must know Abraham. Abraham is the father of the faithful. He's the father of the Jewish nation. And ladies and gentlemen, the Apostle Paul lays down the life of Abraham somewhat in detail for you and I to imitate and emulate, and to find out what he did by faith and what faith prompted him to do. Now, I see faith standing in the middle as I analyze this very carefully. And you'll remember that when we came over the 3rd chapter of this book, I pointed out at that time, and I have repeated it over and over again, that the besetting sin today is the sin of unbelief or disbelief. We simply do not believe God. We do not believe this Bible. And therefore Abraham is held up to us as an example. Now I says that faith, ladies and gentlemen, is something that will cause you to do something. You understand that? Now when we look at Abraham, we'll see that by faith he did this. Not only did it by faith, but after he did it, then of course his faith manifested itself in the actions that God did as a result of rewarding him for his faith. Now, as we study Abraham, it will make us stronger. There's no doubt in my mind about it. And as I said in the church today, this is the thing that's lacking. This is the thing that's wanted. And I have a good example. All of you turn with me back into the book of Isaiah. And let me show you that I'm not spending too much time on Abraham. That I'm doing exactly what God through inspiration does. Now turn with me to the 51st chapter of the book of Isaiah, and we'll see what God told Isaiah the prophet relative to Abraham. Now listen. He said, Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek Jehovah, look unto the rock whence ye were hewed. In other words, he's speaking to the Jew now. In other words, he said, I want you to go back and look at this man from whence you came, or in the father of your nation. Listen to it. Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek after Jehovah. Look unto the rock whence you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit which you were digged. Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah that bare you. For when he was but one, I called him, and I blessed him, and made him many. For Jehovah hath comforted Zion. He has comforted all of her waste places, and hath made her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of Jehovah. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and the joy of melody. But my friends, the thing I'm trying to get across, and I hope all of us understand in this lesson this morning, is the fact that if it were necessary for the Jew that was that close to Abraham to look back to Abraham to build their faith, then what about us? Listen to him again. Look unto Abraham your father, and to Sarah that bare you. For when he was but one, I called him, and I blessed him, and made him many. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Abraham had faith. Paul has already made the statement that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I don't want you to think that Abraham could see everything that he did. He could not. As a matter of fact, we've already read here in the 11th chapter that he did not receive the promises. We'll discuss this here in a little while. But now turn back with me into the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis. Now we pick up Abraham in the 12th chapter, and we follow him for the next 8 or 10 or 12 chapters. But today I want to go back now into the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis to show what I just said, that Abraham did not see everything. God called him out of his land, out of his city, that is the city of Ur in the land of the Chaldees. And he said, I want you to leave this land and go to a land that I'll show thee. And I'll make of thee a great nation, and I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee and thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now Abraham did not know exactly what God had in mind, but he believed it. Now listen to this. Verse 12 of chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Now he's talking about Egyptian bondage. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance. Now at this time, remember Paul already said in Hebrews 11 that of one, just one individual, all of these people came about. All right. But thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. And in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. Now what does that say? That is simply telling me that Abraham understood that he never in his lifetime would enjoy the physical promises that God gave to him. In other words, he said, I'll give you this land. But at the very same time, he understood that it would be 4 generations removed until the iniquity of the Amorite was full, that his own people had to go down into a strange land where they would stay some 400 years. Now, this reminds me of a passage found over in the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 3, and I'd like for all of you to turn back there if you will. Now, I'm talking about Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, right in there. But now listen to what this prophet had to say in verse 2 of chapter 2 of his book. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. Verse 3, chapter 2. For the vision is yet for the appointed time, and it hasteneth toward the end, and shall not lie, though it tarry. Wait for it. Listen. In other words, God says, what I tell you, you wait for it. It doesn't make any difference how long it tarries, you wait for it. Now what did he say to Abraham? I'll give you this land. Wait for it. I promise you this land. Wait for it. How long must I wait? Well, your seed, of which you don't have any just yet, will have to go down into a strange land and stay for 400 years. It will be at least 4 generations of the Amorites before this land will ever be yours. Abraham understood that. He was not deceived. He did not have one parcel of land to put his feet as long as he lived in the land of Canaan. As a matter of fact, when his beloved Sarah died, you'll remember he went down and had to buy the caves of Machpelah in which to bury her. He was not deceived. He understood exactly. Listen to what Habakkuk said. I'm in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3. Listen to it. Hasteneth toward the end, for the vision is yet for the appointed time, and it hasteneth toward the end, and shall not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not delay. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot of people that just don't have the patience to wait for God. In other words, this is the thing in the church. We have a lot of people that start off well. They'll work for a little while, and then they'll fall by the wayside. And I'm here to say from observation, now this is not just a philosophy on my part, this is observation, that there's very few of us that can remain faithful to our call and to our trust and to our promises to God for a year's time. Now you look back the past year of the people that you've been dealing with in the church and seeing how many of them have fallen aside, how many of them made pledges that they never lived up to, how many of them made promises that they cannot keep for the simple reason that we do not have the faith. We don't understand that God says that faith is something that you only see through the eye. It's the evidence of things to come. But let's go back now to verse 8. Let's see if we can analyze very carefully here. As I look at this, first of all, I list, if I were outlining this, I would list the faith of Abraham. And then I would list the faith of Sarah. And then I would list the faith of both of them. Now, what did the faith of Abraham cause him to do? And what did the faith of Sarah cause her to do? And then what were the results of the faith of this great couple? All right, now let's look in verse 8. Number 1, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed to go out unto a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is more than simply words. I can relate to this being a preacher, because I have the brethren to call me away from my home and from my people and my surroundings, familiar surroundings, to come into new places to live, to work. It isn't easy to do. As a matter of fact, we've got very few people that can do it anymore. You've heard me say that in Nashville, Tennessee alone, I don't have it out, that we've got 500 men plus that are claiming to be gospel preachers that you could not blow out of that town with an atomic bomb. They don't intend to leave it. The Bible says to go into all the world and preach the gospel. Now, what if I were to come to you and say, why don't you leave your country and your kinsmen and go with me and let's move to Alaska and we'll start a congregation? How many of you people that are listening to me right now could do that? I can relate to Abraham. I can identify with him. I know exactly what God required of him. Listen to it. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed to go out unto a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. W-A-S, was. Future tense. Look at that. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. In other words, apparently he had never been there before. And he simply started the journey by faith. Now that's number 1. Now look at number 9, verse 9, and let's see the second thing. By faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise. A sojourner, not a citizen, not a part of it, not a landowner, simply a sojourner. An individual passing through. I made the statement that he didn't own any of that land. His sons did not own any of that land. When his beloved Sarah died, he had to buy a cave from Machpelah to bury her in. Think about it. How many of us can leave a little 125 by 150 foot lot to follow God's command to go into all the world and preach the gospel? How many of us can close our homes down for a month or two to go into the harvest field or into the mission field to do God's work? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it would do us well to think about what we're talking. I find that it's almost a physical impossibility to start congregations anymore, for the simple reason that everybody wants a congregation in his own backyard. In other words, we're not going to drive across town. Nobody's willing to do that. And therefore we cannot get any support in doing anything that needs to be done, for the simple reason that people don't have any faith. There's no doubt about it. Now listen to it. He was a sojourner in the land of promise, as in a land not his own. Listen to me. He dwelt in tents, temporary abodes, booths, tents. Put them up, tear them down, move, set them up, tear them down. How many of you women could live that way? How many of you women would follow your husband into an area like this? This is what Sarah did. All right, listen to me now. By faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise. Number one, he left his own land. Number two, he stayed in a land where he was a sojourner. All right? Now, number three, he dwelt in tents. Now let's look for number four. Why did he do this? Verse 10. Because he looked for a city which hath the foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Whose architect and framer is God. Whose builder and maker is God. Now ladies and gentlemen, he understood that there was a city being prepared. And let me say right now, as I've said so many times, that Jesus has gone back to heaven to prepare a city. Now this city that Abraham looked for, this city that he described so well and so minutely to his son Isaac, to his grandson Jacob, to Joseph, all those patriarchs that caused them to live as they lived, that city is in heaven. It's being worked on right now. And one of these days, that city will come back to this earth. After this earth has been renovated, after this world has been cleaned up, and that city will be right here. That's exactly what Abraham understood. I hear someone say, Brother Rudd, you say that so emphatic. You really believe it? All you've got to read is the 3rd chapter of the book of 2 Peter, and also the 8th chapter of the book of Romans, and you'll find out that God intended this earth to be our abode. Now you've heard me say, and I've got it right here, that probably the finest commentary written on Hebrews is by Milligan. It's in the Gospel Advocate series, and I've got it right here before me. And let me read you what he had to say about this very thing. Now listen to me. And so also we think in respect to the heavenly country. The patriarchs seem to have received revelation concerning it which have never been transmitted to us. For it is obvious that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in constant expectation of entering it at the close of their earthly pilgrimage. They were satisfied to live here as strangers and pilgrims, knowing that they had in heaven a city having permanent foundations, whose architect and framer is God. Now let me do that again. They were satisfied to live here as strangers and pilgrims, knowing that they had in heaven a city which has a permanent foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Now listen to what Milligan said. This city is manifestly the heavenly Jerusalem, spoken of in the 4th chapter of Galatians, the 12th chapter of Hebrews, the 13th chapter of the book of Hebrews. Listen to me. Which for the present is located in heaven, but which will hereafter descend to the earth, after that it, that is the earth, shall have been renovated by fire. Revelation 21. Then will be fulfilled in its full and proper sense the promise made to Abraham that he and his seed should be the heirs of the world. Isn't that something? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the thing that kept Abraham going, and this is the thing the lack of which is responsible for us being as weak as we are. We don't believe this. We simply don't believe this book. You've heard me say this time and time again, that we don't believe this book. Ladies and gentlemen, if we believe this book to be a divine revelation from heaven to earth, we would believe exactly what God said. All right, listen to me now. All right, now let's go to Sarah in verse 11. I said, first of all, that we'd talk about the faith of Abraham. What did it cause him to do? Now then, the faith of Sarah. By faith, even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she was past age, since she counted him faithful who had promised. Now, ladies and gentlemen, listen to me well, brethren. I have no indication that God has ever forced himself on any people. And I firmly believe that if Sarah had refused to believe God, that he would not have overwhelmed her in such a way as to cause her to conceive. Now think about that just a minute. Now I realize I'm familiar with this great lady, and I know that at first she wavered just a little bit. She laughed at the thought a woman her age would give birth to a child. But Paul says she came around. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive seed. All right, now, was this power, does that modify faith? No. That word power modifies the word conceive. In other words, God did not necessarily help her believe. But after she believed, God gave her power to conceive. When was it? Past the age of bearing children. Since she counted him faithful, see that? Only after she counted him faithful who had promised. God fulfills his promise to us only after we believe him. Now look back in verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Now, brethren, we can do nothing without faith. That's number one. God will not deal with us until we get faith in him. Without belief in God, it's impossible to please him. You understand that? All right, now, Sarah believed it, and she had a child. Now look in verse 12. Wherefore, or therefore, or as a result of, in other words, I'm going to sum up the life of these two great people. First of all, Abraham, Sarah, now them. Wherefore also there sprang of one, that's Abraham, and of him as good as dead, 100 years old himself. You see that? As many as the stars of heaven in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these promises to Abraham, as I look at them very carefully, every one of them carries a twofold meaning. In other words, there was a physical blessing connected with them, but there was a spiritual blessing. I don't have any doubt that Abraham now is seeing exactly what God promised to him. And that is that of all of these seed, I'm talking about Christian people, from the day of Pentecost down to the present time, you could not number them any more than you could number the stars in heaven, nor could you count them any more than you could count the grains of sea by the seashore. All right, now look. These all died in faith. Now what are the antecedent, or what is, or who are the antecedent of these? Well, I understand he's talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah. Now, I don't see anyone else before that time. I think this is the subject matter, and this is what the Apostle Paul had in mind. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having confessed that they were strangers and sojourners on the earth. Now, this is something that we're not willing to confess. We don't believe it. We believe that we're here permanent. We don't want to leave this earth. We're in love with it. Therefore, we're not like Abraham. For they that say such things make it manifest that they are seeking after a country of their own. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if you can pull up stake and go any place that the God of heaven sends you, if you can do exactly what God said, not understanding why, then of course that manifests, that action, that faith, that work on your part tells the world that you believe what God said. Now listen, verse 15. And if indeed they had been mindful of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. God did not force Abraham to leave Ur. He did not coerce him to stay down in the land of Canaan after he got there. Once he got there, he could have readily turned around and gone back. He understood that. You remember when he sent his household servant Eleazar up to Damascus, back over there to get a wife for his son? He said, I don't want my son Isaac to go back into Chaldea. You remember that? All right, look here. They could have. They had an opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country. Do you think that there's anything better than where we are now? A lot of people apparently don't think so. I believe that there's a better country. I believe that heaven is so much greater than this that we cannot comprehend it. And if we understood that better country, then we would not be in love with this country. But now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly country. Wherefore God is not ashamed of it to be called their God. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it looks to me like that if we don't desire a better country, this country that God has for us, that God might be ashamed of us. Isn't that what he said? Look at it again. But now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed of them to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Are we ashamed of that city? Do we think that that city is inferior to these that we build down here? Nashville, Memphis, Atlanta, Birmingham, San Francisco, Chicago. All of these cities have been built by men. Now we're in love with them. Do you think that they're comparable, that they can compare with that city that God made? Now think about it. By faith Abraham being tried offered up Isaac. Yea, he that hath gladly received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Look at there. Even he to whom it was said, in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God is able to raise up even from the dead. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it scares me when I think about the faith of this man. And when I think of the lack of faith that I have. Listen to it. Offering his only son, leaving his country, doing anything that God said him. God directed him to do. For whence he did also in a figure receive him back. In other words, God says, kill him. Abraham said, I believe that God will raise him from the dead if I do it. That's how much faith he had. All right. Verse 20. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even concerning things to come. Now, we'll not take time to go into these inheritance that we find back here in the latter verses of and chapters of the book of Genesis. Go back and read them. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, laid it on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was nigh, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. You can read all about that in the latter chapters of the book of Genesis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me say before we close this lesson today that I'm not spending too much time in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, with the exception of the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. It's the most important chapter in the Bible. The 2nd chapter of the book of Acts tells us when the church was established and how to become members of it. But ladies and gentlemen, the 11th chapter tells us how to live after we become a member of it. And I suggest that all of you who are having trouble living the Christian life, master the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. Zero in and read this 11th chapter until you're familiar with it. Now next week we'll pick up Moses. We'll study. I want to summarize very briefly Abraham, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, in the first class, in the few minutes of our class next week. And then we'll get right into Moses. All of you study very carefully. Go back, learn the birth of Moses, how he left the Nile, went down into Egypt, back up into the land of Canaan, the wilderness. We'll pick him up next week. All right, it's time for another good lesson, and all of you take your Bibles, turn to the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. You know, we've made this statement at the outset, and we've continued to make it all the way through, that possibly there's no other book in the entire Bible that will give us an overall concept of the Bible than the book of Hebrews. I don't have any doubt about it. I've also said that the 11th chapter is one of the great chapters of the Bible, right along with the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts, the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And I want all of us now to be familiar with it, because this is the roll call of faith. Now notice in chapter 12, verse 1, the Apostle Paul says, "Therefore let us also, seeing that we're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." I don't have any doubt now that his figure moving into the arena as if we were down running the race of life, and these great witnesses up here in the bleachers or the stand watching us, that they're referring back, or he's referring back to these individuals that he's enumerating and elaborating on here in the 11th chapter, these great people of faith. All right. Now I said last week that I needed just 3 or 4 minutes today to sum up the life of Abraham. Turn back with me, if you will, into the 7th chapter of the book of Acts real fast. I'll not take but just a minute. We spent considerable time on it. But now, turn back, if you will, into the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, and I'm talking about the sermon, that great sermon of Stephen that cost his life. You remember that? All right, now look down in verse, well, we'll just begin reading in verse 1. "And the high priest said, Are these things so? And he said, Brethren and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham." Someone said, "Where are you, Brother Rudd?" I'm in the 7th chapter of the book of Acts. "The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I understand right, and to be minute about the life of Abraham, then Abraham actually received 2 calls. He received one of them down to the city of Ur, and then God reappeared to him and called him again up in Haran. Now watch me here. Now Abraham, when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, may I say that Abraham stayed in Haran 7 years. All right? And he said, "Get thee out of thy land and from thy kinsmen, and come into the land which I will show thee." Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, God removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. And he gave him none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on. And he promised that he would give it to him in possession. Now we found out last week, and this is in keeping with the Bible, that Abraham did not actually possess the land of Canaan. He did not own it. Now notice that Stephen said that he had not even a foot, not a bit, to put his foot on. And to his seed after him, when as yet he had no seed. And God spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and treat them ill 400 years. And the nation to which they should be in bondage will I judge, said God, and after that they shall come forth and serve me in this place. Now I'd like to recommend to all of you that are really serious students of the Bible, that in connection with the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, you study the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, because Stephen elaborates the history of the Jews. Now, while I'm talking about this, we have the very same thing over here in the 13th chapter, related by the Apostle Paul. Now hold your fingers there and look in verse 16. "And Paul stood up and beckoned with his hands and said," I'm in the 13th chapter, "Men of Israel, and ye that fear God, hearken. The God of this father Israel chose our fathers, and exalted the people when they sojourned in the land of Egypt, and with a high hand led them forth out of it." Now Stephen starts back with Abraham. Paul, on the other hand, starts here with Moses. But let's go back here into the 7th chapter. "And God spake on this wise, and his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage, and treat them ill 400 years. And the nation to which they shall be in bondage will I judge, said God, and after that they shall come forth and serve me in this place." Now that brings us down to the lesson today under Moses. "And he gave him the covenant circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac, and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob the 12 patriarchs. And the patriarchs, moved with jealousy against Joseph, sold him into Egypt, and God was with him. and delivered him out of all of his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all of his house. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is how came the Israelites to be down in Egypt. In other words, from the time that God called Abraham until they went down into Egypt was 215 years. They stayed in the land of Egypt 215 years until they were led out and encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai under Moses 215 more. All right, the Apostle Paul in the 3rd chapter of the book of Galatians says that from the call of Abraham to the giving of the law was 430 years. Now, this is a piece of history that all of us needs to understand. All right, now you remember that because of jealousy, these patriarchs sold Joseph down into Egyptian bondage. And then when a famine came into the land, Joseph and about 75 souls went down there, and that's how came them in Egypt. All right, someone said, how many? 75. Look in verse 11. And there came a famine over all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenances. Now you remember Joseph interpreted the dream and told Pharaoh that this would happen. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent forth our fathers in the first time. And at the second time Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's race became manifest unto Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and called to him Jacob his father, and all of his kindred 75 souls. 75 souls went down there. All right, now this is the beginning of the great race of the Israelite people. And when Moses led them out some 215 years later, they numbered over 2 million people. All right, now let's go back to the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, if you will. I'm down in verse 24. Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Let's go back to verse 23. Now, I've skipped 23 for the simple reason that I wanted to pick up the faith of Moses. Now then, we've got to go back. And I'm a firm believer, ladies and gentlemen, in the case of Timothy, and in the case of Samuel, so in the case of this man, that a person's faith begins before him. In other words, Moses had a mother that had considerable faith. By faith, Joseph, when his end was nigh, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave commandments concerning his bones. Now, I don't want you to think that these were the only men of faith. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents. In other words, these were parents who had faith just like Joseph had faith, because they saw that he was a goodly child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments. Now, what do you learn, Brother Rudd, from this verse right here? First of all, we've got to understand that the children that we bring in this world will be something. They will do something. It may be for the benefit of mankind or to the detriment of mankind. But I want you to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that no person is an island to himself. And I'd like to say to you parents, to you mothers and you fathers that are listening to me right now, that these children that you have under you will grow up to be something. Now, what that something will be, you will have a considerable influence in determining. Now listen, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here is a case of civil disobedience. We do not always obey the laws of the land. As the Apostle Peter said in Acts chapter 5, we obey God rather than man. Now, we're to be law-abiding citizens as long as these laws do not violate God's law. But if civil government happens to make a law that violates God's law, then we're to violate that law. I think everybody understands that, and I'm happy to live in a land that advocates this. We believe in civil disobedience. All right, now watch me. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a goodly child. How could they see that? Only through the eye of faith. They believed it. This is what this chapter is all about. And they were not afraid of the king's commandments. And my friends, we're going to have some people today that are not afraid. We've got too many people that are. All right, now, verse 24. We leave his parents, we pick up Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I've got Josephus here. You hear me talk about Josephus often. And those of you who are interested, I'd like for you to get Josephus and read the life of Moses. When Moses grew up, you understand that he was the rightful, legal, lawful heir of this great Egyptian throne and government. And he became a general under Pharaoh's army. He had control of all of his army. He marched down to fight the Egyptians, and it was there that he won the prize, that is, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians' daughter is the one that he married, the black woman that he married. Now, he was an individual that was an individual. Now, someone said, Brother Rudd, is that double talk? No. In other words, he was individualistic in his thinking. In other words, he could buck the tide if it was necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, there has never been another lawgiver like Moses. I could speak from now until when on Moses and the ability that he had as a leader. And I want you to understand one thing. I tell people this, especially young men that are aspiring to preach and to be leaders and elders and deacons in the church, that God can only use people that are prepared. Now, I believe this. God tapped Moses because Moses was the right man. If you're not being used for a great work, it may be that you're not qualified for that great work. The thing we need to do is to qualify ourselves. Pray God, let God know that we're willing to do his work. Any place, anywhere, anytime. But ladies and gentlemen, make yourselves ready. Now, when God wanted a warrior, he got Joshua. When he wanted a great leader, he got Moses. When he wanted a man of faith, he called Abraham. When he needed a good woman, he got Sarah. You understand that? But ladies and gentlemen, these people did not become good after God called them, but God called them because they were good and great to start with. All right, by faith, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, what do you see, Brother Rudd? Well, I can see something that a lot of our children don't have. In other words, he was proud of his lineage. He was proud of his heritage. He was proud of his mother and father. We've got too many people that are ashamed of it. Now, they were not something to be proud of necessarily from the standpoint of the world, but Moses was proud of his parents. He was proud of where he came from. And he refused to be called the son of his adopted mother. Why? What did he choose? He chose rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Now, people, it's hard for me to cover these verses because I see so much in them as I go along. This idea that most people are painted of sin is responsible for a lot of young people and old people alike getting into sin. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is something alluring. There's something enticing. There's something inviting about sin. There's a pleasure in it. There's no doubt. This passage right here says this. There is a pleasure in sin. That's why so many people live in sin. Now, we don't need to get up here and try to tell people something that they know to be false. Now, when you get up as a teacher and try to tell people that there's no pleasure in sin, you've got people that are sinners back here that just been out the night before and they had all kinds of fun. They did enjoy it. The thing that we need to do is to admit it. Admit that there's a pleasure of sin. But then go one step further and show that it's short-lived. That's the thing about it. Look at it. That he suffer ill treatment with the people of God, than enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I could get all of us to understand a little bit about eternity, I'm talking about time. What does it mean to live forever and ever and ever compared with the 70 short years that we live upon this earth? You mean to tell me that we could not give up 70 years of pleasure to live with God forever and ever and ever? Now think about it. Now this is what Moses did. Moses says, I will suffer ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, accounting the reproaches of Christ. Look at that. The reproaches of the Christ, greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. And I think I hear someone say, Brother Rudd, do you think that he knew Christ? Well, sure he did. You think that he knew that there would be a Christ? Why, absolutely he did. Turn back with me into the book of Deuteronomy. Well, someone says, where are you? Well, let's go to the 18th chapter. 18th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and listen to Moses himself in verse 15. Jehovah thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. All right, now look at verse 18. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and I will put my word in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him, and it shall come to pass, that whosoever will not hearken unto my word which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Moses understood. God told him. Just like I said about Abraham last week, there's a lot of things that God revealed to those patriarchs that he did not see fit to record for us. It's not necessary. He told them about heaven. He told them about the hereafter. He told them about immortality. This is the thing that led them on. This is what they believed. Moses had the same faith. He chose rather to account the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we know something. As a people today, we know something of the treasures of ancient Egypt. And there they were at the disposal of this man. But he said that he cast them aside as nothing. Look at here. They are greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked unto the recompense of reward. Now people, this is what we've got to understand. That God will reward us. I said last week when I was talking about that city that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob looked forward to, that there is a city. Now think about it. What's wrong with our cities today? Well, everything's wrong with them. In other words, they're decaying internally. We've got diseases. We've got sanitation problems. We've got traffic problems. We've got smog problems. We've got housing problems. We've got unemployment. We've got all kinds of stuff. But ladies and gentlemen, in that city that Abraham looked forward to, in that city that God says one of these days will descend back to this earth, there will be no smog. There will be no disease. There will be no housing problems. There will be no traffic problems. Why? Because the architect, I'm talking about God himself, has designed that city. Won't that be something? Now Moses saw that. Look at that. And he understood that if he lived for God, there would be a recompense of reward. God would reward him for it. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. In other words, he had God before his eyes at all times. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can too. We can see God. We can see him through the eye of faith. The reason why we don't is because we're not reading the Bible. Turn back with me to the 9th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. 9th chapter of the book of Jeremiah, and see what Jeremiah had to say. Verses 22 and 23. One of my very favorite passages in the Bible. You've heard me say this many, many times. Someone said, where, Brother Rudd? 9th chapter of the book of Jeremiah, verses 23, 24. Thus saith Jehovah, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches. But let him that glory in this, that he knoweth me, that I am Jehovah, who exerciseth loving kindness, justice, and mercy in these things in the earth, because in these things I delight, saith Jehovah. Do we know him? How would you like to have a constant companion that is absolutely kind, absolutely just, absolutely righteous? You can have. That's God. You've got to walk with him. You walk with him by faith. All right, look here. By faith, he forsook Egypt, verse 22, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured. Who endured? Moses did. As seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover. Kept the Passover. You know what that means? What is this? What is the Passover? Do you know the night that angel passed over and the firstborn of everything in Egypt died? Now Moses and his brother Aaron had gone into the presence of Pharaoh and said, I want you to let my people go. And it was Moses that brought these plagues. Of course, God working through him, but brought them on there. He had to have faith, ladies and gentlemen, to do that. How would you like to go into the very presence of a hostile king like a Pharaoh and do what he did? He had to have faith. Look here. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, that the destroyer of the firstborn should not touch them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it took a lot of work on the part of Moses. It took a lot of preaching, a lot of persuasion, a lot of teaching to get those people to believe what he said. In other words, I want you to put some blood up on these lintels, every one of them. Don't you think there were scoffers down there? Don't you think they said, we don't believe in such thing? We haven't seen anything like this before. How do we know it's going to come to pass? By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying to do, were swallowed up. Now this is just in a nutshell, some kind of a syllabus, a synopsis of the life of Moses. Look what he had. First of all, we find him put out there in that little cradle on the river, hid 3 months. We find him found by Pharaoh's daughter. We find him growing up in Pharaoh's court. When he became a man, a general in his army, the general in his army, gave all of that up. You know how he killed an Egyptian? Had to flee up into the land of Horeb around Mount Sinai, where he stayed some 40 years. Now let me sum up the life of Moses like this. Moses lived to be 120 years old. And all of you remember his life into 3 parts. In other words, 40 years he killed an Egyptian. The first 40 years. Then he fled into the wilderness, where he stayed 40 more years. When he was 80 years old, God tapped him. He goes back down into Egypt, calls his people out for the next 40 years, welded them into the greatest nation, peculiar people that the world ever saw. Ladies and gentlemen, has given us some of the finest laws that we can find any place. All of the laws that we have in this country, I'm talking about the law of equity, is founded right here on these great 10 commandments given by Moses. Think about the faith that he had. The Israelites drew back and they said, if we have to talk about God or have to talk to God, we'll not do it. Moses had the faith to go up 40 days and 40 nights in that blazing top of Mount Sinai and receive these 10 commandments. Now, it's not necessary, I suppose, that we know about as much about Moses as we do anybody, because we're familiar with his life. Ladies and gentlemen, it took faith, and a lot of faith, to do what Moses did. All right, let's see what we have. Verses 23, right down then through verse 29. And then we pick up this young man Joshua, right-hand man of Moses. We can read his life. Now let's go back and sum up, and I see the old clock says that I'm just about through. But anyway, up until through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, we have a record of the antediluvian world. I'm talking about the world before the flood. And basically we're talking about Enoch, Abel, Enoch, Noah. Alright, then in the 12th chapter we pick up Abraham. I'm talking about Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now that's the way to study the Bible, and that will bring us to a close of the book of Genesis. Alright, now, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we can read about the life and the exploits of Moses in his faith. Now then, when we get into the book of Joshua, we find Moses having died, Joshua takes over. And you'll remember that he led the Israelites around to the east side of the Jordan. The Jordan River parted just like it did under Moses. And they passed in. You read then the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, and you'll find what happened to these people once they come in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a life of faith. This is a roll call of faith. But once again, very hurriedly, turn with me now, and we'll look at verse 30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down, after they had been compassed about for 7 days. You remember that God told them to march around that city one time every day for 6 days. And on the 7th day, march around it 7 times, blow the horn. Now that looks foolish. How many of us could be persuaded to do something like that? Joshua did not hesitate. Here he was, a warrior. Wonder why he didn't say, let me fight them, let me hit them head on. God said, no, you just march. You just march. Well, why not do it 2 times? No, just do it 1 time. I can tell you, he didn't hesitate. Now, people, this is the thing that we've got to have. First of all, we've got to know what God said. And number 2, we've got to believe Him. And when we can get this back into the church, knowledge of God's law and faith in this law, then of course we'll see the church growing again. But the old clock says I've got to go. We'll start right here with Rahab the harlot next week. All of you take your Bibles now and turn to the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. You know, this is an awesome chapter, and I don't use that word inadvertently. I mean, there's some heavy materials in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. And I think it well that all of us study it and study it well. Master it, memorize it, put it in our minds where we'll not forget. Because here is a roll call of faith and tells us exactly what God intends His people to do. Now, if I remember correctly, I think we're down to ready for about verse 30. We spent considerable time on Abraham and Sarah and Moses, and now we're ready to get into one chapter, verse 30, which has to do with Joshua. Now let's read from verse 30 right on down to the end of the chapter, if you will, please. All of you take your Bibles. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot perished not with them that were disobedient, having received the spies with peace. And what shall I say more? For the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness was made strong, waxed mighty in war, turned to flight armies of aliens. Women received their dead by resurrections, and others were tortured, not accepting their deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed asunder, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and the holes of the earth. And these all, having had witness borne to them through their faith, received not the promise. God having provided some better thing concerning us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In other words, what he's saying, if I understand this last verse, is that God was not willing to reward them until time came to reward us. All right, now look back in verse 30, if you will. You know, I was reading the book of Maccabees. All of us are familiar with the book of Maccabees, and I don't have any doubt that he speaks of the Maccabees right here when he's talking about who through face of the kingdoms wrought righteousness, obtained promises, and so forth, that he was talking about the Maccabees. And I was reading, and let me reach back here and get it, what the old Mattathias, that's the father of the great sons, had to say to his sons to spur them on. And I want all of you to understand now that I'm not spending too much time, we're not spending too much time in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. Now in the 2nd chapter of the first book of Maccabees, old Mattathias, just before he died, had this to say: arrogance and reproach have now grown strong. It's a time of disaster and hot anger. I'm talking about 150, 75 years before Christ is when this speech was being made to his sons. Now listen to it. Arrogance and reproach have now grown strong. It's a time of disaster and hot anger. Now, my children, you must be zealous for the law and give your lives for the agreement of our forefathers. Remember the deeds of our forefathers which they did in their generation, and you will win great glory and everlasting renown. Was not Abraham found faithful when he was tried, and it was credited to him for uprightness? Joseph in his time of distress observed the commandments and became master of Egypt. Phinehas, our forefather, for his intense zeal, obtained the promise of an everlasting priesthood. Joshua, for carrying out his orders, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, for bearing witness before the congregation, obtained an inheritance in the land. David, for being merciful, inherited a royal throne forever. Hannah, Azariah, Mishael, that is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had faith in God and were saved from the fire. Daniel, for his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of lions. Observe this from generation to generation, that none who hope in him will fail in strength. Be not afraid of the words of a sinful man, for his glory will turn to dung and worms. Today he will be exalted, tomorrow he will be nowhere to be found. For he has returned to dust, and what he plotted will perish. My children, be manful and strong for the law, for by it you will obtain glory. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this old man thought was essential to spur his sons on to greater things for God. Now, right here in the 30th chapter, we pick up the life of Joshua. You know, Joshua became the general or the leader of Israel upon the death of Moses. He was 85 years old at the time, and he lived to be 110 years old. He divided the land, gave each one of the tribes their allotted portion, and was a great leader. And the Bible says that by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about for 7 days. You know, I never cease to be amazed as I study this book, the accuracy of it. And at the very same time, I am amazed at the lack of study that my brethren put in relative to it. Now notice it says by faith the walls. Now notice that word walls. It has an S on it, not just a wall. In other words, apparently there were walls around Jerusalem, more than one. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down. In other words, they were not destroyed. They did not fall inward, they fell out. Now we can read all about this in the 6th chapter. Turn back with me, if you will, and I think it will if we take just a little time. Turn to the 6th chapter of the book of Joshua. I'm talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. Just before Judges. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thy hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall comfort the city, all the men of war going about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout. And the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him. Now here it says the wall of the city. Paul in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, the book that we're studying, says walls. Now ladies and gentlemen, let me say that these walls were 15 feet apart. There was an outer wall and an inner wall. The outer wall was some 6 feet thick. There was a 15 feet space or feet of space in between, and then the inner wall was twice that, some 12 feet thick. And on the top they had houses built. So you could view it either as one wall or as walls. Now the Bible says, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat. That's what God said. And if you'll notice here that it shall fall down flat. And the people shall go up every man straight before him. And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said unto them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of Jehovah. And they said unto the people, Pass on and compass the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of Jehovah. Now I've got a little book here that I spend a lot of time in, somewhat like Josephus. It's Haley's Bible Handbook. And I recommend this little book to anybody that's interested in the Bible, and I know you are. This is a Bible study, and I think that I do it justice. And I think I do a great service when I recommend good books to read. And this is a good little book. It gives us some outline and some detailed account of the archaeological finds of the Bible. And I want you to see here what he has to say about the fall of Jericho. Now in chapter 6 of the book of Joshua, Jericho was taken by the direct help of God to inspire the Israelites with confidence in beginning their conquest of more powerful people. Led by the ark of the Lord with trumpets blowing, they compassed the city 7 days. Hovering above were the invisible host of the Lord. Chapter 5 verse 14. Waiting for the appointed hour, and on the 7th day, at the blast of the trumpet, the walls fell. In an amazing prophecy, a curse was pronounced upon anyone who would attempt to rebuild the city. You can find the case of this over in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. Now let me say by way of passing that the Jericho that we read of in the New Testament is not this Jericho that we're speaking of here. There's been 2 or 3 different ones. All right, the walls of Jericho enclosed about 7 acres. It was an inner fortress city for the thick populated roundabout. New Testament Jericho was about a mile south of the ruins of the Old Testament Jericho. The modern village of Jericho was about a mile to the southeast. Now, back in 1929, there was an archaeologist from the university over in England, Dr. John Garstang, director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and of the Department of Antiquities of the Palestine government, evacuated the ruins of Jericho. Now this went on for some 7 years, from 1929 to 1936. He found pottery and evidence that the city had been destroyed about 1400 BC, coinciding with Joshua's date, and in a number of details dug up evidence confirming the biblical account in a most remarkable way. Now listen to this, friends, carefully. The walls fell down flat. Verse 20. Dr. Garstang found that the wall did actually fall down flat. The wall was double, the 2 walls being 15 feet apart, the outer wall 6 feet thick, the inner wall 12 feet thick, both being about 30 feet high. They were built, not very substantial, on faulty, uneven foundations of brick 4 inches thick and 1 to 2 feet long laid in mud mortar. The two walls were linked together by houses built across the top. And this is where Rahab's house, on top of the walls, was situated. Now, Dr. Garstand found that the inner walls fell outward and down the hillside, dragging the inner wall and houses with it, the streak of bricks gradually getting thinner down the slope. Ain't that amazing? They fell outward to indicate that it was God who did it and not the power of Joshua and his people who destroyed Jericho. All right, the foundation of the palace, 4 courses of stone high, remained situated tilted outward. In other words, they stood in a sitting form tilted outward. Now the palace did. Now I said that the walls fell outward. Dr. Garstand thinks there are indications that the wall was shaken down by an earthquake, of which traces may be seen, a method which God could have used as easily as any other. All right, now, in verse 24, I'm talking about chapter 6 of the book of Joshua. Now notice I've already quoted verse 20. So the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. Now this is what this archaeologist said happened. Now look in verse 24. In verse 24, and they burnt the city with fire. That is, Joshua and his people. They burnt the city with fire, and all that was therein, only the silver, the gold, and the vessels of brass and of iron, they put into the treasury at the house of God. Now listen to me carefully. They burnt the city with fire, verse 24. Signs of this and other destruction were very marked. Garstand found great layers of charcoal and ashes and wall ruins reddened by fire. The outer wall suffered most. Houses alongside the wall were burned to the ground. The stratum generally was covered with a deep layer of black burnt debris, under which there were pockets of white ash overlaid with a layer of fallen reddish brick. Keep yourself from the devoted thing, verse 18. Garstand found under the ashes and fallen walls in the ruins of storerooms an abundance of foodstuff, wheat, barley, dates, lentils, and such turned to charcoal by intense heat, untouched and uneaten, evidence that the conquerors restrained from appropriating the foods, just exactly like God said they should do in verse 18. All right, now let's read verse 18 of chapter 6 of the book of Joshua. Now look at me very carefully. In verse 18, and as for you, only keep yourself from the devoted thing, lest when you have devoured it, you take of the devoted thing, so would you make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. And we have found through our archaeological discovery, ladies and gentlemen, and every time we uncover something, it corroborates and affirms the evidence of the Bible. Now go back to the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews and see again. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about 7 days. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's no earthly reason why these walls would have fallen down or this city have been captured by this means. The only thing you can say is, by faith, we please God, and without it we do not. God told these people what to do. They did it because they believed Him. They saw the results of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now don't forget that. All right, verse 31. By faith Rahab the harlot perished, not with them that were disobedient, having received the spies with peace. Now, let me read that again. It sounded like I might have said that she perished, but she's perished not. Rahab the harlot perished not because of faith. She perished not with them that were disobedient, having received the spies with peace. Now you know the story, will not take time, but in case you don't, turn back into the book of Joshua we were just read, and you'll remember that Joshua sent out 2 spies to spy out this city. Now, the case of Rahab is a little bit different than a lot of people think. And ladies and gentlemen, if you will take a little time to study this Bible and do a little research, you'll find that this Bible is more interesting and fascinating than you might think it is. Now, Rahab was not an ordinary prostitute in the sense that we think of prostitution. In other words, she was a heathen goddess, and she was devoted to sacred prostitution, something that those people did not ban or look down on like we do on prostitution today. Not only is that so, but there is a possibility that she may have retired from that, and the name simply stuck to her, and she was an innkeeper. And she had, we would call, what they called in the old days, a tavern or an inn or a hotel where people came in to eat supper. Now this is exactly what happened. These spies that Joshua sent out spent all day long in the city, walking around the walls, looking at this point, that point, very minutely surveying the walls and the gates and the doors to see which would be the most susceptible place for them to take this city. They did not at the time understand that it was God who would destroy it. They thought they were going to have to fight it, scale the walls and so forth. All right, just about sunset, these two spies went back into this little tavern, or as we would call a little wayside cafe that was operated by Rahab the harlot. All right, now, she knew them. She knew who they were. About the same time, the king began to eat, and someone came in and told him that two spies were there to look out the city, and the last time they saw them, that they were down at the inn of Rahab. So he sent two men down to inquire, to get those men, to bring them up and torture them to find out exactly what they would do. You can read all about this in Josephus. I'm not just making this up. All right, Rahab knew about it. She knew of the Israelites. She had heard what happened, and she believed that these people were directed by God Almighty, because nobody could do the exploits that they had done except God be with them. I said she was a religious woman. She knew something about other people's religion, although she was a heathen at the time. She had begun to believe in the God of the Israelites. And she told a lie. Told those spies to go upstairs to hide under some flax that she had up on a roof. And when these men came in from the king, she lied to them and said that these men have already left. And if you'll hurry and pursue them, you should catch them before they cross the river. Well, now someone says, is that right? Well, no, I don't guess a lie is right under any condition. But it seems like, as I looked into this case and other cases in the Old Testament, and you can find many of them, where people seem to lie by our standards, that they could tell things that were not true as long as they did not make an oath out of it. Anyway, she said that the spies had already gone when in reality they were still there. And she made them promise her by oath that when this city was to be destroyed, that she and her family would be saved. And you know the story, how she let the little scarlet threads out the window, and Joshua, because of the oath, honoring this oath that his spies had made, directed all the people, as God had directed them, to kill everyone, woman, man, child, baby, everything, with the exception of Rahab and her family. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll turn over to the first chapter of the book of Matthew, you'll find that Rahab the harlot is in the direct line of the genealogy of Christ. Without dispute, she became a well-recognized and respected figure among Jewish history, and in Jewish history, the Jewish people. Joshua allotted her and her family a parcel of land as a result of this good deed, and she married one of the leading men of the time, a man by the name of Salmon. And from Salmon and Rahab, Boaz was born. Now you know Boaz is the man who married Ruth, and then Boaz had Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. So you can see, ladies and gentlemen, this is very fascinating and interesting when you begin to study this Bible as it ought to be. And these are more than just words on a page. This is sacred history, things that happen. All right, let's read it again. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot perished not with them that were disobedient, having received the spies with peace. All right, Paul said, and what shall I say more? Or what shall I more say? For the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel. Now these are not in chronological order. You might want to take just a minute here and let me straighten these out for you. The Apostle Paul did not mean to be given them according to a time sequence or chronology. He simply lists them all together. Now if we were to list them in the order as they are listed up to this time, in other words, we're talking about Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, in that order. In other words, each one of them fell after another. But now the Apostle Paul seems to be growing tired, and he says, I think I've got my point across that you people can understand. I don't have the time to talk about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel. So he just throws these in. But here is the order. You put Barak first. He comes first. All right? Gideon comes second. And then Jephthah. And then Samson. And then Samuel. And then David. In that order. Now you'll remember that after Joshua died, the government of God's people fell to the lot of judges. There were some 15 judges. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah. All right, now Deborah was the fourth judge. She was a woman. And you'll remember in her exploit that she sent up to get this great man Barak to go up and fight one of the outstanding enemies of the Jews. And he says, I will go only if you go with me. All right, now this is the Barak that we're talking about right here. All right, now, and then Gideon. We all know Gideon, the timid individual that just couldn't believe out of his humble surroundings that God would call him. You know, he said when God said that he wanted to go up and fight for him, he just couldn't believe it. A man of my position, my low estate, that God has called me. And people, there's a lot of us this way. We just don't believe that God can use us in the conditions that we're in. You remember he put a fleece out and he says, let everything be wet and my fleece dry. And then when that happened, he reversed the order. I may have it reversed. And he said, all right, now let everything be dry, let my fleece be wet. And it was. And finally, God convinced him that he intended to use him, that he had tapped him for his work. Now, all of us know Samson. I don't have any doubt whatsoever as I read and study about Samson that all the heathen exploits of Hercules are nothing more than garbled, perverted exploits of Samson. Don't have any doubt about it. Samson was the great strong man. Jephthah. You know, Jephthah made the rash vow that he would offer the first thing that came out to greet him when he got back from war, if God granted him the victory and his little girl was the one who came out. David, we know about David. We know Samuel, who was the last. We know how Samuel made the statement, if I have done any of you wrong, they said, no, you haven't done any of us wrong. Now, the reason why I say that is this. Now notice, these through faith subdued kingdoms. Now, not all of them. In other words, this is what we call an elliptical sentence. In other words, this applies to some of them. Now, what I should say, some of these through faith subdued kingdoms. Some of them wrought righteousness. Some of them obtained promises. Some of them stopped the mouth of lions. Some of them quenched the power of fire. Some of them escaped the edge of the sword. Some of them from weariness were made strong, waxed mighty in war. Now you understand what I'm saying? Now, let me say this also, ladies and gentlemen, that many times preachers and Bible teachers leave the idea that these people that we talk about were what we would call in our modern speech saints. In other words, they were above sin, that they were not ordinary people like we are. This is not so. And the Apostle Paul is not necessarily even talking about their lives. He's not talking about whether they were saved or whether they were lost. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that Samson was one of the biggest sinners of all times. Now, he committed suicide. He pulled the walls down himself. So I don't think that the Apostle Paul could be praising him for that. I don't think he could be praising David for a lot of things he did. But ladies and gentlemen, a man's life is not a smooth road. I want all of us to understand this. In other words, all of us have our ups and downs. We're stronger one day than we are the next. And if you study, and this is why I emphasize so much, that Abraham walked with God so many years, that Moses worked with God 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years led the Israelites 120 years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, 120 years is a whale of a long time. And we have just a little condensed thing about it. And a lot of people get the idea, well, they were doing this every day. No, no. These were ordinary folk like us. They put out farms. They put out crops. They lived on farms. They raised livestock. They raised sheep. They had to take care of these things. You understand that? But here, there, they were living for God, and now the record takes these things and puts them together and shows that they were great men of faith. All right, now, what the Apostle Paul is saying, that these people who accomplished these great things did it because they believed in God Almighty. And you and I can do the very same thing if we have faith. That doesn't mean that we have to be out here in the public 24 hours every day, 7 days a week. I used to think as a young man when I first began to preach that I had to be preaching all the time. When I studied Jeremiah and Ezekiel and so forth, I find out that God didn't use those men all the time. They had a private life. They took care of themselves. They did this and they did that. But when God called them and when God used them in a public way, ladies and gentlemen, they were giants because they had faith in God Almighty. But that old clock says that we've talked long enough. These Bible classes are wonderful. This is a wonderful book. Let's read again. And what shall I say more? For the time will fail me, and the time has failed us. So I think that we'll stop and start right here next week. All of you mark your Bibles, and we'll begin at about verse 32, and we'll try to end this chapter in our next lesson. All right, I just doing a little research here for our lesson in Hebrews chapter 11. And all of you turn with me now to Hebrews chapter 11. This is the great chapter on faith. Now, we've spent considerable time, I don't think undue time, but we've spent considerable time in this chapter. Now, if you remember, way back on, I don't know how long ago, when we first started this, I talked about what Paul was doing here with faith. Now, he makes the statement in verse 6 of chapter 11 that without faith it's impossible to please God. For they that come to God, or those of us who come to God, must believe that He is, and is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. All right, now he shows us what faith does. He tells us somewhat in a brief definition of what faith is. But I think the best thing that he does about faith is to give us the example of what it does. Now, we have gotten down, if I remember correctly, to about verse 32. And what shall I say more, for the time will fail me, if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and so forth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot of controversy about Jephthah. And I think it would do us well after we have left chapter 11 for us to know something about these people. I said that the book of Hebrews would give us a better understanding of the overall understanding of the Old Testament, and an overall understanding of the Old Testament than possibly any other book. All right, now chapter 11 tells us something about these men. Now, turn back with me, if you will. And that's what all these books and commentaries here before me are. I was simply sitting here studying and doing a little research on this man Jephthah. Turn to the 11th chapter of the book of Judges. Now you'll remember that he was a judge, went up to fight for God and made a vow, a rash vow, a lot of people say. Now look in verse 29 of Judges chapter 11. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. the 7th book of the Bible, the 11th chapter, verse 29. It says, the Spirit of Jehovah came upon Jephthah, and he passed over Gilead and Manasseh, and passed to Mizpah, and so forth. And Jephthah, verse 30, vowed a vow unto Jehovah, and said, if thou wilt indeed deliver the children of Ammon into my hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth from the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, it shall be Jehovah's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah passed over the children of Ammon to fight against them, and Jehovah delivered them into his hands. Now drop down into verse 34. And Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances, and she was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. All right, now look up, if you will, in verse 30. And Jephthah vowed a vow unto Jehovah, and said, if thou wilt deliver them into my hands. Verse 31. Then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth from the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the battle of the Ammonites, then it will be Jehovah's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Listen to this. I will offer it up for a burnt offering. All right, now in verse 34, and Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrel and dances, and she was his only child, because besides her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass, when he saw her, that he rent his clothes, and said, alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low. Thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto Jehovah, and I cannot go back. And she said unto him, my father, thou hast opened thy mouth unto Jehovah. Do unto me according to that which thou hast proceeded, or that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth. For as much as Jehovah hath taken vengeance for thee on thine enemies, even on the children of Ammon. And she said unto her father, let this thing be done for me, let me alone 2 months, that I may depart and go down unto the mountain, and bewail my virginity, I and my companions. And he said, go. And he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. And it came to pass at the end of 2 months, that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew not man. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the question is this. Did Jephthah actually offer his daughter as a burnt sacrifice, or an offering, a burnt offering, unto God? Now, I've got Josephus, number 1, right here. And let's see what Josephus has to say. Now, he says that when he came back, he fell into a calamity no way corresponding to the great action he has done, for it was his daughter that came to meet him, for she was also an only child and a virgin. Upon this Jephthah heavily lamented the greatness of his affliction, and blamed his daughter for being so forward in meeting him, for he had vowed to sacrifice her for God. However, this act was to befall her was not ungrateful to her, since she should die upon occasion of her father's victory and the victory of the liberty of her fellow citizens. She only desired her father to give her leave for 2 months to bewail her youth and her fellow citizens, and then she agreed that at the forementioned time he might do with her according to his vow. Accordingly, when that time was over, he sacrificed his daughter as a burnt offering, offering such an oblation as was neither conformable to the law nor acceptable to God, not weighing with themselves what opinion the hearers would have such as a practice. Now the footnote, the author says that Josephus condemns Jephthah justly for his rash vow, for it was sacrificing his daughter, or for dedicating her into perpetual virginity. All right, now I've also got Milligan. Now Milligan seems to be of the opinion that he did the same thing. Now he says, and the subsequent sacrifice of his only daughter in compliance with his vows shows also very clearly that he ascribed his success in the war to the God of Israel. In other words, Milligan seems to intimate that he offered her as a sacrifice. All right, I've got the commentary out of Barnes' notes. Now, Barnes does not write this. This is written by Cook, but they fill in Barnes' notes. Now, listen to what he said on verse 31. He said, the words of this verse proves conclusively that Jephthah intended his vow to apply to human beings, not animals. For only one of his household could he be expected to come forth from the doors of his house to meet him. They also preclude any other meaning than that Jephthah contemplated a human sacrifice. This need not, however, surprise us when we recollect his Syrian birth and long residence in a Syrian city. Now, the Syrians and the Phoenicians were conspicuous among the ancient heathen nations for human sacrifices, and the transfer under any circumstances, Jehovah, of the rites by which the false gods were honored is just what one might expect. In other words, now there's three people, or three scholars, who seem to think that Jephthah did offer his daughter as a sacrifice. Now, I've got here the great Adam Clarke, and let's see what Clarke has to say. In verse 31, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. The translation, according to the most accurate Hebrew scholars, is this: I will consecrate it to the Lord, or I will offer it for a burnt offering. That is, if it be a thing fit for a burnt offering, it shall be made one. If fit for the service of God, it shall be consecrated to Him. That condition of this kind must have been implied in the vow is evident enough. If a dog had met him, this could not have been made a burnt offering, and if his neighbors or friends' wives, sons, or daughter had been returning from a visit to his family, his vow gave him no right over them. He makes the statement that anything that comes out of my door, besides human sacrifices, were ever an abomination to the Lord, and this was one of the grand reasons why God drove out the Canaanites. All right, in verse 39, it appears evident that Jephthah's daughter was not sacrificed to God, but consecrated to Him in a state of perpetual virginity, for the text says, she knew no man, for this was a statute in Israel, namely, that persons thus dedicated or consecrated to God should live in a state of unchangeable celibacy. Thus, this celebrated state is without violation or violence to any part of the text, or to any proper rule of construction, cleared of all difficulty, and caused to speak a language consistent with the self and with the nature of God. In other words, Adam Clarke does not believe that Jephthah offered his daughter. All right, now, I've got Matthew Henry. Matthew Henry says that Jephthah's vow is dark and much in the clouds. When he was going out from his own house upon this hazardous undertaking in prayer to God, for his presence with Him, he made a secret but solemn vow or religious promise to God that if God would graciously bring him back a conqueror, whatever or whatsoever should first come out of his house to meet him, it should be devoted to God and offered up for a burnt offering. At his return, things of his victory, or tidings of his victory, coming home before him, his own and only daughter met him with a seasonable expression of joy. This put him into great confusion, for there was no remedy. After she had taken some time to submit her own infelicity, she cheerfully submitted to the performance of his vow. All right, now listen. It seems more probably that he offered up for a sacrifice according to the letter of the vow. All right, Matthew Henry seems to think that. Now then, I've got Dr. Benson, an old commentary that I like very much, and let's see what he says. He says, all therefore that Jephthah did with his daughter according to his vow was to devote her to a single state as a Nazarite or consecrated person, to be employed in the service of God in the tabernacle under the care of the high priest, probably in making the hangings and other ornaments of it, the habit of the priest, the showbread, the cakes used in sacrifices, and such like offices, and to continue in a virgin state till the day of her death. Now, it wasn't uncommon back in those days for people to do that. And we've got a case of Hannah, who also vowed that if God would give her a son, that she would consecrate him or devote him to God. I'm talking about Samuel. We know that case in 1 Samuel 1 verse 11. All right, now, if only a dog had met Jephthah, would he have offered that up for a burnt offering? Well, no, because dogs were not acceptable as burnt offerings to God. Well, someone says, Brother Rudd, what do you think? Well, I don't think that he offered up his daughter. I believe there is things that we ought to know that we don't know about the Bible, and too many of us go off half-cocked. Now, I want all of you to turn back with me in Leviticus chapter 27. In Leviticus chapter 27, and let's read what could happen in a case like this. Where are you? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. So we're talking about what? The fourth book of the Bible. So turn back with me, if you will, into the last chapters of the book of Leviticus. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the third chapter, the third book. I said the fourth. And let's see what we can find. Now, here are some laws, and I think that all of us need to be familiar with these. Now listen to this. And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When a man shall accomplish a vow, now this is what we're talking about, Israel. We're talking about the rash vow of Jephthah. The reason why I'm spending so much time, I've heard my brethren for years get up and talk about Jephthah offering his daughter as a burnt sacrifice or a burnt offering. I don't believe it. I never did believe that. All right, now listen to this. And Jehovah spake unto Moses and said, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When a man shall accomplish a vow, that is, make a vow, the person shall be for Jehovah by their estimation. Listen. Thy estimation shall be of the male from 20 years old, even until 60 years old. Even the estimation shall be 50 shekels of silver, after the shekel of the sanctuary. All right, now, drop down in verse 9. I'm in the 27th chapter of the book of Leviticus. And if it be a beast thereof, an offering of relation unto Jehovah, a man shall give of such unto Jehovah shall be holy. In other words, if you offer a beast, and then you want to get out of that vow, then the high priest could put a value on it, and you could pay money instead of the sacrifice. Now this is exactly what it's saying. All right, in verse 14. And when a man shall sacrifice or sanctify his house to be holy unto Jehovah, then the priest shall estimate, whether it be good or bad, as the priest shall estimate it, so shall it stand. In other words, here's again. A lot of times then a person would make a vow, and they say, if you will do this, talking to God, or if this comes to pass, I'll give a member of my family, or I'll give some beast, or I'll give my house. Now then, if you want to get out of that vow, then of course what are you to do? Well, you're simply to go to the priest, let the priest make an estimation according to the 27th chapter of the book of Leviticus, and get out of it. Now someone said, Brother Rudd, could that be done? Absolutely that could be done. All right, now, over in the case of Matthew, I'm talking about the case of John the Baptist. Herod vowed a vow unto this young girl that anything that she asked, up to the half of his kingdom, he could have gotten out of that vow. I have a lot of my brethren, I've heard my brethren in Bible classes saying, well, you've got to commend him because he was honest. He stuck by his word. No, he was stupid. And anybody who makes a rash vow and then later learns that it's rash, or finds out that it's rash and wrong, the thing he needs to do is get out of it. Now God will let a person back out of his vow if he finds it's wrong. And I want you to notice that's exactly what he's saying. But I pass that by way of information to you, and I think it'll be beneficial. I've heard too many people And too many people that claimed to be Bible teachers that didn't know what they were talking about, that did injustice to this man. I don't no more believe that Jephthah offered his daughter as a burnt offering. I don't believe that God would accept that. He wouldn't have accepted the sacrifice of a dog, and he did not accept her. But let's read on. Where are we now? We're down in verse 32. And what shall I say more? For the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samson, or Samuel. I pointed out last week that the order was Barak, then Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, Samuel, David, and then of course the prophets. All right. What shall I say of these men and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, and quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, waxed mighty in war, turning to fight armies of aliens. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we talked a little bit last time about this faith. Wrought righteousness as a result of their faith. Anybody who has faith in God will do acts of righteousness, because these two things are inseparably connected. I say that faith and righteousness. Now turn back with me, if you will, into the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. And let's see what the Apostle Peter has to say at the household of Cornelius about this very thing. Now, what are you talking about, Brother Rudd? We're talking about what Paul said people did as a result of their faith. He said they wrought righteousness. All right, in Acts chapter 10, when the Apostle Peter went into the household of Cornelius, he said in verse 34, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him. Now listen to me. Let's read that again. Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. In other words, he doesn't think more of me than he does of you. He doesn't think more of you than he does somebody else. He's no respecter of persons. But in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him. What did I just say? I said that faith and the working of righteousness are inseparable. In other words, if you're a man of faith, you will do something. Now, is that what James says? Turn to the 2nd chapter of the book of James. James is arguing with people who said that they had faith but didn't do anything. Now, we've got a lot of people today, and I don't think that this is an old-fashioned issue or an old-fashioned question when I talk about what a person should do if he claims to have faith. Now, you tell me you have faith, and it's an imputation on my part to say to you, or it's an imputation on you if I were to say you don't have faith. How do you know, Brother Rudd, I don't have faith? Well, I believe I can tell whether you have faith or not. Now turn down with me, if you will, into verse 14 of the 2nd chapter of the book of James. And James says, what does it profit, my brethren, if a man say he has faith? This is what we're talking about, isn't it? What shall it profit if a man says he has faith but has not work? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister be naked and in lack of daily food, and one of you say unto them, go in peace, be ye warmed and filled, and yet ye give them not the things needful to the body, what doth it profit? Absolutely nothing. All right. Even so, faith, if it has not works, is dead in itself. Yea, a man will say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith apart from thy works, and I by my works will show thee my faith. Now, don't come around here and tell me that you believe in God and believe in His law if you refuse to do what He said. Now, these little preachers get around here and they say, I believe in God, and I believe that book, Brother Rudd, is as strong as you do. Apparently you don't. You won't believe it, you don't stand for it, you don't defend it, you don't back it up. You mean to tell me that you believe this book when you shy away from the brethren on the qualification of elders, on the withdrawal of fellowship from ungodly members, on preaching about the giving of our means as we ought to, when you tell people that need to be taught what the Bible said about marriage and divorce? You mean to tell me that you believe this book? I don't believe any such thing. In other words, if you say you believe it, show me that you believe it by preaching it. If you don't preach it, then I've got a right to say that you don't believe it. This is what James says. Now, what did Paul say? Paul says that these men by faith subdued kingdoms. They stopped the mouth of lions. Well, we know about Daniel. We know about Samson. We know about David. We know a lot of them. But these men, because of their faith, did these things. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not doing great things, maybe it's because you don't have faith. You ever stop to think about it? I hear people tell me all the time, well, Brother Rudd, it just seems like I've never done anything for God. Well, apparently you don't believe in God. Why don't you start doing something for God? Well, what can I do? Study the Bible and find out what these people did. What did they do? Look right here. They, through faith, subdued kingdoms. All of them? No, some of them. They wrought righteousness. What is that? They wrought righteousness. This is what I've said that Peter said, that God is no respecter of person, but in every nation he that feareth him and keepeth and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him, working of righteousness. Look at that. They obtained promises. Do you obtain promises? Abraham did. Sarah did. All of these men obtained promises. They stopped the mouth of lions. They quenched the power of fire. They escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got too much weakness in the church. We've got too many weak brethren. I hear brethren all the time. Brethren come up to me and say, well, Brother Rudd, how do you get strong and how do you get bold? Where did you get that fearful disposition or fearless disposition that you have? Studying God's law. I want to walk with these people by faith. They wax mighty in war. They turn to fight armies of aliens. Now you ladies listen. Women received their dead by a resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. I asked my wife, do you think that you could stand by the cross, as did the wife of the great Apostle Peter, and watch me being crucified head down if I had enough of faith to do that? Could you do that? Have you ever noticed how we just go all to pieces and get up in the air and mad, ready to fight? If somebody says something about our children or somebody says something about our loved ones, well, ladies and gentlemen, what would happen if our government were to change and persecution were to sweep on us? What would we do? Would we take up arms to defend ourselves? Would we try to kill people who are trying to injure our children? Or would we do like the Apostle Peter's wife and like the early disciples? Willfully, willingly, and wantonly go to the cross and die for Jesus Christ. Well, someone said, Brother, that'd be pretty hard. It isn't hard if you've got faith. These people did it. They received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured. Wife and I were talking about this just this week. Both of us says that we think that we could simply be killed for Christ. But if we were to be burned at the stake or tortured, like some of the early disciples were, that would be hard to take. And ladies and gentlemen, they were tortured, not accepting their deliverance. In other words, they said, if you'll deny Jesus, if you'll deny what you believe, if you'll turn your back on what you stand for, then we'll deliver you from this torture, from this death. I think of John Huss, the great Bohemian reformer, some 1450 year, 1450 after Christ. They burned him at the stake, but before they lit it, they gave him the choice, said, if you'll recant, deny what you said against the Catholic Church, we'll let you up. Old John Huss said, you're roasting a goose. In other words, not accepting their deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. In other words, he was condemned to death. We will raise you from this condemnation. No. He said that'll be temporary. I'll die again. I might as well just die now and look forward to that resurrection, which is better than this temporary resurrection that you people are offering me now. And others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawed asunder. I don't have any doubt that he has reference to Isaiah. History tells us that under Manasseh the king, that he was sawed asunder with a wooden saw. Isn't that something? Could we do that? They were tempted. They were slain with a sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. Maybe they put those on themselves. Maybe they were sewed up in those and put in the arena. I don't know. Of whom the world was not worthy. Surely the world was not worthy of these people. Wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and the holes of the earth. People, we can't go to services, you've heard me say, in air-conditioned cars. We can't go if we've got carpets on the floor, padded seats to sit on. We can't do that. Why? Because we don't have faith. These people wandered about in deserts, mountains, caves, holes of the earth. Look at that. And these all, having had witness borne of them through their faith, received the promise. God promised, they received not the promises. In other words, they received the promise, but they did not receive the fulfillment of those promises. God having provided some better things concerning us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In other words, what I understand this to mean, and I appreciate this, I really appreciate this, that God has waited, that He will reward all of us. I'm talking about Enoch, Abel, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Rahab, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, David, Samuel. These are the ones that He mentioned. He's waited until He can reward us with them at the very same time. Isn't this a wonderful thing? But the old clock says we've got to go. We'll start right here next week, and we'll leave this chapter. There's no way that we can do justice to it. I don't know how long we've been in it, but I know that we haven't done justice to it. We'll start with verse 1 of chapter 12 next week. Mark that if you will, please.